My name is Mark Prudhomme. I'm a part-time professor in education in different university here in Canada in the province of Quebec and Ottawa. And I'm also, I guess most importantly for this video, I'm an educator at an Agile Learning Center in Montreal named Mont-Libre. Today I want to talk to you about, I want to introduce the idea of how to unschool your child during this time of quarantine. So a lot of you are now new to homeschooling given the situation with the virus. I want to share with you one suggestion, which is to homeschool. Obviously, like this is one way of going about home education. There's many other ways. Anyway, I think this is something that could be the benefit of many children in this situation. So I'll start by sharing like why I think, or like a couple of signs of why you could benefit from unschooling your child at this point. Then I'm gonna go on to talk about like how you can do it. And then I want to end with a couple of warnings, or just like to give you some ideas of like what you can expect in the next few days, few weeks, if you decide to start this adventure. Well, first of all, like one of the things that I want to mention is that I've previously recorded this video in French, and I have had a request to do it in English. So the title of those videos can loosely be translated to incomplete conversation about self-directed learning or self-directed education. And I guess the reason why I want to mention this is just to put emphasis on the idea that like this is an incomplete conversation. I don't know how long this video is going to last, but there's a wide variety of dimensions of unschooling that I won't be able to address in this video. And plus, the goal is not only like to talk about it, to inform people about it, but also to provide people with the opportunity to improve on what I'm suggesting. So starting with the signs that like you could benefit from unschooling your children at this point. I guess there's two different signs that I want to share with you. The first one has to do with the younger children. So let's say if you have children that are around the age of, I don't know, anywhere between 6 to 9 or something like that. If you found that in the past few months they haven't had like those laughters that like leads to hiccups as often, or they don't have it anymore, that could be a sign that like you could quite benefit from unschooling your child, especially during this time of quarantine. And if you have older children, if you've if not only like you rarely see like by looking at their body language that they're happy, that they're satisfied, and that like when they're home they try to spend most of their time isolated in their room, and they try to avoid you, that could be a sign that like you could benefit from unschooling. And obviously like with older children, like the I guess the benefits of them of unschooling, it's very likely that it's going to take a longer time before you start seeing them, but nonetheless like I highly invite you to get started. Another reason, one of like I guess there's multiple reasons why they're in school, but today, given the situation, I want to focus especially on the idea of stress. So one of the things that like according to different studies that have been made here in Canada, studies that have been made in the U.S., there's a high proportion of kids who experience stress on a daily basis, and high level of stress, and so it's according to those studies, it seems to be like regardless of where they've been conducted, it's a little more than the majority of kids who experience a fair amount of stress every day, and obviously this level varies from one child to the other. But I think there was one study that was conducted in the U.S. where it's about 27% of kids who claim to experience like extreme stress on a daily basis. And according to some other study, the place where they experience the stress the most is in school, and I think like in the range of like 93%. I could be wrong with that number, but I know like it's a pretty big number. And like those number comes from an article shared by Peter Gray recently. So anyway, like this is something that you can explore if you want to have like the real numbers. So like one of the reasons why like I'm concerned with that number is also that like recently I've been reading quite a bit about addiction, and obviously like the biggest factor that can sort of predict addiction is childhood trauma, but the second one, because obviously, and when we talk about trauma, we talk about like if a child has been physically, sexually assaulted, bullied, that kind of stuff, or neglected in some ways by his or her parents. But the other factors is stress, the stress they experience on a daily basis, and that can obviously like based on what the author was saying. His name is Gabar Mate. Like I don't know how to pronounce his name, but like I highly recommend reading his book if you're interested in the topic. And so if we're saying that like a lot of the kids are highly, like the majority of kids are stressed in school, and like for some of them, for more than a quarter of them, they experience extreme stress level on a daily basis, then I become quite concerned with the likeliness that they become addicted to different things. And when the author is talking about addiction, it could be addiction to a wide variety of things. He was especially concerned with drugs, but it can be alcohol, it could be gambling, it could be shopping, it could be a wide variety of things. So the reason why like I've been talking about stress is that like obviously like unschooling like sets up a space, some sort of dynamic between children and adults, where like according to me like it's highly conducive to reducing those level of stress. And so then the question is like, so how do you do it? So I'm gonna share with you a couple of different either metaphors or like ways of thinking about unschooling. So basically, so the first one that so the one that I want to start with is comes from A.S. Neal. He was the founder of Summerhill, and in one of his books, like the way that he sort of talked about like self-directed learning, especially like more focused at home, was the idea was like he was suggesting that like every decisions that affect your child and your child only be taken by your child. And there's different reasons why like that can be significant for the education of your child, especially like when it comes to learning how to take decisions. To start thinking about like the risk of different decisions. But that would be like sort of a guiding principle. If the decision only affect your child, then it's your child who takes that decision. If the decision then starts affecting other people, then that decision should be taken amongst all the people who were affected. So the example that A.S. Neal was giving was that like, so for instance with his daughter at home, everything that had to do with the hallways in his home, the I guess the living area, the kitchen, the toilet, those decisions that affected everyone were taken together by the family. But when it came to like just that his daughter's bedroom, it was his daughter who could like, she was the only one who could decide about like what was gonna go on in her bedroom, how clean it was, what she would do in there, that kind of stuff. But obviously, like another example that I think that he was giving, but anyway, I think it's useful for the purpose here, was that like, so for instance, if she would start to listen to some music, like she could very well choose whatever music she wanted, but like as long as the volume wouldn't affect the rest of the people in their home. So that could be one way of thinking about it. So if your child is interested in doing an activity and that activity only affects him or her, then like the idea is to let them do it. So in a sense, the idea behind unschooling is that like you want to and here like I'm going to address some ideas that relates to radical unschooling, but like just unschooling in general is to let your children choose what they do, when they do it, where they do it. Obviously, given the virus, like there's limits to that, and with whom they're doing it. So that could be like obviously like for a lot of kids who will start unschooling, I guess in the next few days, a lot of those activities are going to be play. And oh, and I guess like that reminds me, earlier I was talking about stress. One of the reasons why I think it could be significant to unschool during those days is obviously because uh, the whole situation with the virus comes with a lot of stress. You might be experiencing it. You may be trying to make sure that your children don't see it, but at the same time, like they tend to live in our unconscious, so they can feel it in some way. So yeah. So getting back to the idea, so it's to let your children choose what they do, where they do it, how that kind of stuff. So obviously, a lot of the time, like what they end up choosing is play. But if you're interested in radical unschooling, which I suggest in many ways, like this is something that I've been trying to do to an increasing extent with my daughter. You also add the idea of like they choose when to eat, what they're gonna eat, where they're gonna eat it, that kind of stuff, and the same thing with sleep. And it's interesting because like at the beginning when we first had our child, this wasn't something that we were interested in doing with respect to the eating part of it. But then we started like reading about like what it is that you can do in order to raise your child in a way where they're gonna have a healthy relationship with food. And it seemed that like a lot of what's suggested was like let your child choose their food, provide them with options, and that kind of stuff. Avoid guilt. So while talking about guilt, that's the next topic that I wanted to address. Um, Here the reason why I want to talk about it is that like one of the worries that I have is that like, so for instance, there's some families who are going to be interested in unschooling, and so they're going to let their children get involved in the activities that they're interested in. So while they will allow them to explore those activities, some of the parents are going to use guilt in a way to sort of guide their children towards more academic activities. For instance, it could be other types of activities, or like to guide them towards specific choice. So I encourage you to avoid guilt as much as possible. And the reason is that like to me, like it's just like it just provides uh, children with like another form of stress, and which in the long run, like they're not doing the thing that you want them to do for the right reason. They're just doing it to please you, or to like stay away from the fear that might come with the guilt that like that you might be sort of like using here. So this is one of the things that like I highly invite you to avoid. So moving on, like the other metaphor that I wanted to share here, sort of to introduce the concept, is many of you might have seen the T video about consent. So this is a video that sort of compares sexual intercourse with like drinking tea, and or like offering tea. And so if you haven't seen the video, I highly suggest that you watch it. So one of the things that like that's mentioned, that suggested, well, that's it's suggested, that's put it mildly, but is the idea that like, so if you offer someone some tea, if they say no, you're not going to make them tea. If they say no, not only are you not going to make them tea, but you're not going to force them to drink tea. So the same thing here applies to academic stuff or different activities that you might find interesting, but that like at this point your child might be interested in doing something else. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of different comparisons that can be made between unschooling and what you can see in that T video about consent. So another comparison that I like is the idea. So for instance, you might in the T video you might have had like tea with someone in the past, but that doesn't mean that they want to have tea with you today, or that they want to have tea with you at this moment. So what that implies for unschooling is that like maybe your kid were interested in doing some math or history or what have you with you yesterday, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be interested in doing it today. Another one is that like maybe they've said yes to the tea, so they're interested in drinking. They start drinking it, but at some point, if they don't like it anymore, they don't have to drink it anymore. So here again, like the same thing applies to unschooling. So maybe you're doing an activity like it's just, I don't know, it's just jamming or playing music. So they're interested in joining you. They decide to join you. You start playing music, but then at some point they're not interested anymore. So then like the idea is to let them turn to another interest. Um, so then in that context, what can you do? One of the things that I suggest is that like you offer some activities. Well, I guess I don't even know if I've mentioned it, but like in terms of like, and that's another comparison with a tea video. Is that for instance, so if you offer someone some tea, they say no, you don't come back to them and ask them for tea again 5 minutes after, and then 10 minutes after, and then 15 minutes after. Again, so if let's say you wanted to read with your child or what have you, they're not. They say no. You don't come back to them and ask them 5 minutes after or 10 minutes after. But however, like this is something that you can definitely do is to propose some activities, and while respecting their no, which is something that like I think well, which is something that I highly encourage you to do and to feel comfortable with, because then you're also teaching your child how to be like what it is to respect someone's consent. So it's I guess they say no, they say yes. It's a win either way in a sense. So you can offer some activities. They might say no. One of the things that we do at Mont-Libre or Center for Self-Directed Learners is there's that idea of like making objects or things accessible to them, so that the objects will tell the child like pick me up, do something with me. So if you were to come to our center, you would see like there's obviously our center is not that big, but you would see a table where you would find like some robotic stuff. You would see it just lying around, just there, not hidden in boxes, but just like accessible to the child. You'd see another table where there's like art supplies that are again like in the children's space. There's a music instrument lying around. There's a table for woodworking. There's a table with 3D printers, like with stuff like just accessible to the children so that they can start playing with it. Obviously, stuck in quarantine at home, you don't necessarily have access to all of those things, but there's probably a couple of things that you can think of that you might have that you can make accessible to them. Would be paintbrushes, would be a musical instrument, it could be board games, and actually like so as I said, like one of the things that's likely to happen is that like your child will be interested in playing at first, and for a lot of children that could be well, I guess playing or screens depending on the age of the child. And so some of you were highly concerned with screens. Like obviously there's ways of doing unschooling without the screens. I discourage it, and in this context, given the quarantine, given that like children cannot don't necessarily have any ways to play together, like I suggest that like especially in that context that you let them use it as much as possible. If you're not comfortable with it as much as possible, you can reduce it. But getting back to that idea of addiction, if you're worried about addiction, if the screen is the addiction, if you take it away, the addiction is going to reemerge somewhere else in some other way. It could be drugs, could be alcohol. Obviously, it's not necessarily something that everyone has at home these days, but like it's going to take another form. So that's one of the reasons. Obviously, like I would invite you to let them be invested in whatever activity they're interested in, and what else? What did I wanted to say? So you offer some activities. You provide like you put stuff in place that is accessible to them, but obviously like it might be possible that for the first few weeks they're just going to be interested in doing their own thing, their own activity, and if it's video games, well, like I invite you to take interest in those video games, so to ask them if you could play with them or to ask them to teach you how to play, and this asking them to teach you how to play, usually for a lot of kids becomes like really significant, because then the roles are reversed, and it can be good in many ways, in terms of self-esteem. The same thing can apply to arts. If like, because for instance, some of them, the kids are really interested in like drawing or painting, well, so you can ask them to teach you how to paint. That can be quite interesting. The other point that I wanted to mention in terms of like how to unschool, and this is a suggestion that I usually do to any new educators that we have at the center, and so I guess that advice is to try to talk as much as they talk to you. So what that means is that, like, let's say there would be like a transcript of the conversation between you and your child. You wouldn't talk more than they would. I mean, like, if they talk more than you, that's a good situation. But like, and I guess the reason why I mentioned this is that it's with the concern that you want them long term to have access to your ideas, and like, conversation is just like, there's that subtle way of like, controlling what's being said, what's being done, what's being thought. But like, if you're comfortable with the idea of just talking as much as they do, then long term they're more likely to come back to you, and get involved in conversations with you. Well, I guess maybe one way to sort of justify that idea is that, for instance, for most of you who've been to school when they were young, in the cafeteria, has it happened quite often that you went to eat with your math teacher? Like in my case, this is something that I've never done in the 5 years that I was in high school. Well, anyway, 5 years. Anyway, I was 5 years in high school, and and because I wouldn't have those conversations with the math teacher, well, I didn't have access to his ideas. And here I'm not talking about like conversations about math, but I'm talking about conversations about a whole wide variety of different topics. Could be what's going on in the world. It could be about like issues that I could have been confronted with as a teenager. It could be like relationship. It could be friendship. It could be like, so conversations about all those different types of topics about which like usually there's a lot that like you can teach, but like if because if you control a conversation to an extent where like they're not interested in being in the conversation with you anymore, well, they're going to try to avoid you as much as possible, and in that context they won't have access to your ideas. So the idea is to try to talk as much as they do, so that can look like is that, for instance, like whenever we have a new child that comes to the center, like I would say hi, I would say how's it going. If they barely reply, if it's just like in monosyllables and it's just like a yes or a no or something like that, then I just move on to do something else with somebody else, and I try again the next day. How's it going? How was your weekend? If there's a conversation that emerged, I will stay in that conversation, as long as I see that like through their body language, through how much they talk, they're interested in being in that conversation. So if they're not, I just move on to something else, and I'll try again the next day and see where they're at, and trying like just subtly by just like, hey, how's it going, or what do you want to do today, or something like that. So anyway, those are a couple of ideas of about like how you get on school. The next topic that I wanted to address is just sort of more like not necessarily a warning, but like I want people to start like I want you guys to be able to sort of have like I want to share like what you can expect in terms of like what could happen. Obviously, if you're starting this with like children who are much older, it's more likely that like whatever the interest that they really had in their heart, like the longer they've been like the longer it's been since they really had like chances to explore that interest, the more likely it is that like it's going to take a while before they become interested in other things, that you like in other types of activities, but also in academic stuff. But regardless, I invite you to give it a try. The sooner you start that with your children, the more likely that like it's going to take just a few weeks weeks before they become interested in participating in other activities with you. And those first activities usually are play, which I invite you to indulge in. So there's sort of like that waiting period of like, if you're starting this with like a 15-year-old, well, that might take like a certain number of months before they start showing interest in other activity, which is something to be expected. But like to me, this is something that in the long run, when they become adults, like they're still going to be interested. Like it increases the likeliness that they're still going to be interested in having conversation with you, having access to your ideas, and having satisfied that need to play or to explore that interest and being able to move on to something else. The other thing that I wanted to address that like are more specific to the virus to some extent, but like that do relate to education, is the idea that like, and those are two topics for which I have no solutions, but I want to just name them, throw them out there, so that we can start brainstorming about like what we do about this. The first one is that like, so the conversation that we're having here about like what to do about the education of our children in this situation is a privileged conversation in the sense that like it's not everyone that has like the financial means to be thinking, oh, like I can use this quarantine as an opportunity to do yoga or to exercise more or to start painting or to start writing that book or that kind of stuff. So then like for those who are less fortunate in terms of their means, like I don't know what to do in this situation, but I wanted to name that problem. And the other thing is that like for a lot of children and a fair amount of women as well, being at home is one of the most dangerous places to be. Hopefully, this is the case for a very small number of people, but I'm afraid it's the case. And in the context of the quarantine, I'm not sure what we should do, how we can help. But I wanna name that issue. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If there's any questions, topics, comments, like I invite you to share them in the comments. And if you're interested in what you heard and you speak some French, I have more videos like that on the YouTube channel. And although I don't have too many, but we also have some on our I used to do a fair amount of Facebook Live. Some of them are in English, about topics that relate to self-directed learning. So you can find them on our Facebook page. If you look up Mont-Libre, it's MONT hyphen LIBRE. Thank you. Bye.